right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Deborah Moore with the Youth Work Learning Lab at the University of Minnesota in the School of Social Work. I get the privilege and the honor of spending a lot of time with folks like you out in community, running youth programs and creating learning spaces for you. So that is always my joy. I also spend about half of my time in the undergrad and graduate degree programs teaching. At the U, and I always have to say that if you're interested in getting a degree in youth work, you should. We're one of the few universities in the states that offer such programs. So you should send me an email and we can talk. With that, first of all, I'd like to just welcome Jocelyn and Rachel and Lori. They have been on the kind of planning team, and my big thanks to all of them for helping get this organized. I'm pretty excited about providing some support because of the networks. So hello to Rachel and Jocelyn and Lori. Round of applause for them for for all the hard work they have to do. All right, so we're going to get started. We have a lot to go through in an hour, and I know an hour is about the amount of time we can possibly focus on the Zoom without sort of, our eyes bugging out. So we're going to get a move on things. So the first thing I want to do is just sit for just a couple of minutes in our reality right now. And our reality right now is that almost everything has changed. All right. So I want you to pull up your chat box and I want you to type an answer to what daily activities are different for you since COVID-19. This is personal, right? This is not about your program yet. Like, what daily activities feel and are different since COVID-19? All right, get those chat box fingers going. Rachel's going to read some of the awesome responses. Wow, somebody has a desk.
So we've got, no commute, but we're sitting longer. Oh, somebody else has been walking more. That's awesome. School, social interaction, grocery shopping, family. It's awesome. I've been cooking more. I'll say that for sure. Got increasing at home hobbies. I want to hear more about that at some point. And then, unfortunately, yeah, less interaction with others for sure. Feeling more isolated, seeing less of family members. Oh, so many emails.
So many emails. Yes. All right. Thank you for that. I think one of the things I'm encouraging everyone that I work with, colleagues, students, undergrad students, everyone, is that we really have to continue to remind ourselves of the reality we're in, because we're far enough into this right now that it's easy to sort of just go blank for a little while. But so much has changed, and we're still navigating all of that change and continuing change. So that's where we're starting today, is just acknowledging for a minute the change that we've experienced. I think when I thought about evaluation, which was one of the things youth workers started talking about, they were kind of anxious about in the coming year, was evaluation and reporting. Is my sort of response was, well, why everything's changed, so why wouldn't we change something about our evaluation efforts, right? That just makes sense to me. And that's part of why we're doing this series, and provided both a planning guide for you that you'll get today, as well as a whole bunch of other resources to support your evaluation this year, because nothing's the same, and that includes evaluation. So in the guide, what we're going to do is we're really working to find a way to help you make the case that programs need to adapt about what and how they measure during a pandemic. And we're doing everything we can. I am working with Lori and others in the Youth Funders group to kind of bring this conversation up and talk through it, as well as in other places. And this effort today is really to support youth workers and youth programs in figuring that out first from your own space, okay? What's in the guide is a simple planning process that you can use to shift your plans. And there's also a whole curated set of resources and templates that you can use to do what I'm now calling, I've ripped this off from Michael Quinn Patton because he's awesome. And it's a great phrase. I'm encouraging people to think about measurement right now as what we need is real-time measures. Okay. And we'll talk about that as we go along. If you have questions as I'm blabbling, I have very little ability to see your face to see if you're scrunching up like, what are you talking about, Deborah? So will you please put questions or comments in the chat box, and I know Rachel will read them to me. All right, so here's what we're up to today. I'm going to set the context a little bit about what's helpful and maybe what's not helpful about evaluating right now. Then I'm going to get you to dig around and situate in what I think you really need to draw from and what you really need to know in your programs, coming from you and your experiences first, right? Not me, not the experts, not the funders, but you and your young people and your own realities. Then we're going to talk just a little bit about, we do actually know some things about evaluation in similar times. And so I want to make sure that you get some of that, like a peek at that. There's more in the materials you're going to get later. And then we're going to take a dip into the evaluation guide itself, just so you can get a taste of what it is. That's all it will be, is a taste. Okay. Because we got an hour, we got to move along. All right. That's what you're in for. All right. So to go back to this idea of what's helpful or not helpful in evaluation. I love this picture. So look at this sink. What do you notice? Right? This sink is not connected to any pipes. So it can't get water. You can't turn it on. And or if you had water in there, you couldn't get it out. It wouldn't drain. So for me, it's a perfect metaphor for what we can sometimes do around our evaluation. We create this beautiful sink that doesn't really work for us. Okay. And that's what we're trying to avoid doing right now, especially. I think we're always trying to avoid it, hopefully. Doesn't always work that way. But I think right now, with all the extra stress on all of us and inside our youth programs, that right now we really have to be focused on what's most helpful. So to put it out of our context, I thought, well, let's just take a walk outside and see, like, what would that look like if we were getting really not helpful data from other places. And these were the ones, I'm not saying why, but these are the ones that came to my mind. The first example of what would not be helpful data is, how helpful would it be if your doctor tells you that according to your health data, you've gained weight during COVID-19? Thanks, doc. Right, that's helpful. So now what? Or how would you feel right now about being rated on what you do and say to your child when you're trying to get them focused on their online schooling any given day of the week, right? So those of us who have kids at home, I think we all can relate to that one. Like, okay, this is really complicated. So all of that is to say, we're in this incredible time. It's very stressful. There's a lot of unknowns, and in times of stress, just doing data for the sake of collecting it is just not what we need. Okay, so any old data won't do right now. All right, and then we get to this wonderful, I think any old data won't do, but at the same time, there is some data that might be really useful. It's not to say that no data matters. We shouldn't collect any data. So we have thoughts about the kind of data that might be useful. I found this out. I'm always poking out and about in the world. And I just wanted to share, just to give us some contrast. I felt inspired by the kind of data that the Australian government is collecting right now. So this whole report out already. They did this massive data collection, talked to all kinds of people around the country, and they asked really, really critical questions to me. That one of the questions they asked, this is the data, and what they found is, what do we miss most? What do Aussies miss most? And you can see the word cloud of their answers, right? Friends, eat, dinner, visit, family, all the stuff, right? This is really helpful data, and I can imagine if I knew some of those things, it would help me unpack the things that I was missing, or the young people I was working with, what they were missing. We could figure out, is there a way or something we can do about that, right? Are there some actions we could do to bridge those connections or make those things come together differently? I don't know the answer to that, but they would be helpful data. So I'm giving you this, well, first of all, to say, wouldn't it be nice if we had a government that actually collected useful data that we could use right now? But I haven't seen any. I have seen a lot of data, or there has been a lot of information at this point now about how to try to keep young people safer in our programs. That's awesome. But I'd like to know, like, what's it like for the young people that are working in my programs, and what are they experiencing? And I think to already have countrywide data on that is pretty powerful. All right. So we're not the Aussies. So instead of, counting on our government right now to get data, which again, would be a large scale data, may or may not apply in the same way to your young people. I think we should go where we always go. And that is, I want you to start grounding in what's practical, that from your own experience. And I would say that's one of the most important things I teach always about evaluation and research is that there's lots of ways of understanding the world, knowing the world, counting in the world, understanding in the world. And one of those includes our articulation of our own experiences. So that's where we're going to start, right? That's what I'm going to encourage you to do is always start with your own experience as you think about evaluation. So Rachel or Jocelyn has pulled up a poll for us, and I want you to answer this question. I'm going to be asked this question twice. So there's 2 polls. If you scroll, you'll see the same question as question 2. You get to select 5 answers. Okay. So pick 5 things that you think are closest to where you spend your time. So what everyday activity, the question is, what everyday activities did you spend a lot of time on a year ago or pre-COVID is what I'm getting at. Okay. Rank your top 5. And when you get through the first iteration of that, then what I want you to do is, okay, what everyday activities are you doing now a lot of your time, right? And again, rank your top 5. And then we're just going to look, we're going to be researchers for a minute. We're going to look and see what we notice. I have no idea what this group's going to say. Look at 1 right now, question 1. And let's see, pull up your chat box, or if you're comfortable, consider going off mute for a second. And what do you notice about this data? What is it telling us? What do you notice about the data in the first time? Well, what were we doing a year ago? A lot. What were we doing? What do we notice about it? Anything stick out to anyone?
I think the connection with actual people. So the like in-person sessions, connecting with youth and connecting with family and staff meetings are all, I'm
right. Look at how high those are. Right. How many of us did primarily work with groups of young people in our sessions every day or whenever we were running them? Or did a lot of us, that many, connect with families regularly? Yeah, so true. Interesting. Okay. All right. And then other comments about that? Staff, we found this in the last session, the session on Tuesday, that apparently in youth work, we spend a lot of time on staff meetings. Because I think it was in the 90s too. I was just laughing about that. I'm like, y'all haven't been in a university environment. So until you're in a university environment and staff meetings, like, I'm sorry, but no, that's interesting to note. Like, think about, Jocelyn, to your point, you spend a lot of time in meetings and informal ways, and all that's kind of, it's much more difficult to do that right now. And in some ways it might be that now is a time when we need to meet more, because like everything keeps shifting and moving, and there's a lot of uncertainty. All right, so what do we see in the, I'm going to kind of side by side, do we see any differences between what's going on now as opposed to what we were doing? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of change.
More focus on basic needs, like
yeah,
food and yeah.
Right. So that makes
food and
sense. Yeah.
food and technology. Just
food and technology. Right. Food and
That's
technology.
like,
Say more. I was looking at training. Okay. That's interesting. All right. So yeah, I think, I mean, isn't it interesting? So I mean, I think one of the things for sure young people are feeling is that first one, which is in-person session time, right? In our spaces, which do often feel very different than other spaces young people are in. And that's really, that looks very different. And did we actually, nobody was running any programs on the web before, and now we're at what percentage? I gotta move my poll here. 71%. So think about that. That's a monumental flip, right? And I think that we're all in the middle of just trying to do it. We're not thinking about how huge that is, but just think about all that reality, even thinking about if 71% of your time before, and look at, it's interesting, 71% of your time before is in person. Now 71% of your time you're spending with young people is online. that's a great piece of data to share, right? And to understand, and what are the implications of that? I think it would be the next question, right? Okay, so do we see so any other things you're seeing in the data then, Jocelyn, if you'll flip back to the.
I think what Mary Beth was getting at was the technology piece. So 0 folks selected solving technology problems pre-COVID, and then that number went up to 64% during COVID. So that's huge, and I think just speaks to the nature of how we're doing programming now.
How we're doing programming and all this stuff that gets I mean, most of us know in youth work, we do plan and we are intentional about what we do, but there also is a large part of our work is that we get in the middle of it and we make it work, right, in different ways, and we adjust and adapt and navigate. And it's a very different thing when you're trying to do that in online spaces, as opposed to being in person, right? So all of that's somewhat artistry. It's just more complicated in some ways. All right.
It's just a different stressor. When you stressors were different, now it's like it does technology back some into students are on, and it's just puts a whole different spin on.
Yeah.
And teachers in particular, because if you had a tech person that set everything up and just
right, we have whole roles and layers of support we didn't need to have before inside our programs. I hear that. I mean, I think I have had to do really quick learning myself, not being the hugest fan of things like social media and technology, right? I've always used it as a tool. But it's not like the amount I have to use this tool now is just huge. And then we all have that learning curve. And then, all the complications of young people, they're not used to navigating some of the things we're using. Maybe we have to help with access to technology, or technology not working, or any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a whole set of, it's like we've become 7 different things now that we didn't expect. So I think the first thing as we think about, thanks for those comments, it's really helpful. It just makes it real. And I'm just trying to illustrate how hard it is for us in our programs right now, and to give you the space to remind yourself of that. So I think one of the things as you're going through and and thinking about your evaluation is just to ground in, what is it you really have to do now, and how has that shifted? Because that is an important part of the story to talk about with your funders and stakeholders, right? Like, this is the kind of stuff that shifted, because if you're not in the midst of it, you may or may not understand it yourself, right? You just might not understand what that looks like on the ground. All right. So that's the first thing I want you to do as you think about your evaluation, is kind of get in that space of your own experience. The second thing I want you to start thinking about is, given what you're experiencing, what kinds of things do you think you need to better understand in order to do your work with young people right now, right? Let's go back to the very basics. And so what I'm going to do is Jocelyn's going to put us all in small group discussion for about, 8-9 minutes, something like that. A couple of people, a group. And you will have these questions in the chat box. And I want you just to pick one. Doesn't matter which one. Just pick a question that you feel like would be fun to talk about. You could sink your teeth into it a little bit. Share who you are and what program you're connected to, so people know. Say hello. People like youth workers and welcoming youth workers. But have a good discussion about some of these questions. And if you can, somebody, when you come back, I'd like you to put out some of your ideas that you talked about, because I suspect you're going to have some good ideas that could be shared across this group today. And we're going to collect all your ideas and make sure they go back to you after the web session today. So Jocelyn's gonna get the Harry Potter port key ready for us, and you're gonna be transported into a chat room, a breakout room for a few minutes. You'll get a warning, and then you'll come back to the main room. So go have a good discussion. This is a time just to settle in a little bit with a question.
Yeah, and Rachel did put the questions in the chat. So when you get in your small rooms, you can unmute, check the chat. There's an ask for help button. So if you can't find the questions, let us know.
back, everyone. We'll give everybody a minute or two to get back in. Why don't you get in your chat box if you would, and type in something that really stuck out to you in from your conversations in your small groups, so we can capture some of the great, brilliant ideas that you talked about on with these questions. Are we all, Jocelyn? I can't see the full.
Yep,
Are we all back?
Everyone's back.
Okay, so if you didn't hear me, pull up your chat box again, and type in something that really stuck out to you about your conversation. It would be great to capture some of these ideas so we can share them with the whole group as part of what you get back from today. All right, anybody want to pop out with a comment from their groups about any of the questions? Something that really stuck out, someone that maybe I don't know, someone that's been quiet so far. I invite you to unmute and share something. It's always good to have someone's voice besides mine in the space.
I'll just jump in and share a couple of the comments in the chat real quick while somebody's working up some bravery to speak up.
Bravery!
Tanya mentioned capturing new learnings about programming, adaptations and changes that will be helpful even when we return to in person. And then Lori took notes for their group. So things that are worries are online overload, so technology and time on screen, which our group talked about as well.
Yeah.
And who is listening to what youth really need. Hiring freezes, budget concerns. So.
Yeah, so much. And how, like, those are really different kinds of reality and pieces of our reality, right? Yeah, so there's a lot, and I think that's going to be the challenge, is there's a lot. All right, so good. So now we're grounded a little bit in sort of what kinds of things. I mean, I think that's the next question you want to ask yourself and the staff and the young people is, what do you think you need to understand to better do your work with young people right now? That's another good place to start. Okay, I'm going to flip a little bit. Your experience, the experience of young people in your everyday lives, those are really important things to understand and know. That's important data for us to tap into. It also can sometimes help to sort of poke out in the world and see, well, what are the evaluation experts saying right now? This is a quote from Michael Quinn Patton. I don't know if anyone knows him, but he actually is a local guy, but he is often called the father of modern evaluation, which is kind of weird. He's like not that old. He's not that young, but he's not that old. But here's what he is saying right now about evaluation. I'll read the quote to you. Our first priority in evaluation during COVID-19 is to adapt evaluation plans and designs now. He urges evaluation to detach from rigor as an absolute standard because answers and responses are needed quickly and change happens often in turbulent times. Instead, evaluation in a pandemic requires different ways of thinking and include what Patton calls real-time data rules, okay? So he's thinking really differently as someone, this is his whole world, it's been his whole professional life around what we should be doing and advising as evaluators to folks right now and saying, we got to change it up. We got to think really differently about it. I also have put on this slide just this picture. This comes out of, what is it? I think it's UNESCO. I think it's UNESCO. But there's some international organizations that are putting out a lot of data and a lot of support and reminders to people about just the general overload because of information right now. And you think about that playing into, there's so much overload in our personal lives as well as our professional lives that's hard to step back from. And so that's also a factor in sort of our reality. And so I think right now the experts are saying we got to really think differently. That's what I'm seeing out there. I'm also going to go a little closer home and say that I've created recommendations based on three kind of pieces of knowledge. One is I sat in and listened to every youth program network I could listen to multiple times. I had multiple conversations with youth workers around the Twin Cities in particular, really just trying to understand what it was like, what was happening, what people were anxious about, all of those things, right? So I listened to folks. I also created these recommendations from my own experience, having been in the field for 34 years in the Twin Cities and youth work, about what I know and in my understanding of evaluation and research work. And then I looked at the literature that I could find, and there actually is literature out there, not so much on COVID-19, although there's a little bit coming out now, mostly practical things, more than there's not data in the same way yet, but there is literature that relates from other pandemics or natural disasters about how to think about and think through evaluation and what we should focus on. So there is some stuff, right? And that's what created for me the material to come up with these 4 recommendations. So as I talk to funders, as I talk to stakeholders, as I talk to youth workers, these are the things that I, Deborah, am suggesting to you to consider as you think about your evaluation. And the first thing is, I want you to just say, I need to let go of my expectations for measuring before COVID-19. All right. It doesn't mean that you might not measure some of the same things, maybe in different ways. It might mean then you don't measure some of the same things. But I think we need to really let go of expectations that we have as the reason to do any kind of measurement right now. Okay. That's a big deal. The second recommendation I have is that we shift measurement to focus on what's the most critical challenges that we're facing, and that the challenges that give us the most insight to adapt and document what we're doing to shift, which is what someone just said in the chat box, right, Rachel? That we really need to shift to what's most critical so we can adapt and continue to adapt and adjust as time moves along. We are in a pandemic cycle for a while yet, right? And there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to figure out. It's both, okay? The third recommendation is that we consider using less formal and more frequent data collection cycles. And what I mean by that is maybe it doesn't look like in-person practice observations using the YPQA, even though you all know, if you know me, I love the YPQA. I'm the one, I've done a lot of work on that in Minnesota over the years. It might mean that we're not using surveys in the same way. And because in part the above, that things are constantly shifting. And even if we go through these formal longer processes, by the time we get through them, something significant might have shifted and it's not going to be relevant data anymore. So we're really pushing to informal and more frequent data collection. Okay. Which makes it easier in some ways. And the fourth thing is that I think it's really important. I think we'll forget about this one. It'll be harder. And it's one where I hope that we can count on funders and stakeholders to help us out a little bit, is we really want to start to capture what has shifted and how we responded, because I agree. I think that what we're doing, I'm hearing some innovation already. I'm hearing some very sensible decision-making processes about what to do and what not to do. How to shift, all of those things. And I think that's going to help us as we move forward. I mean, I think we're all hearing right now that pandemics is just not, it is going to be a part of our future, this kind of situation, whether it's due to a natural disaster or again, a virus like it is right now. This is not going to be the end of this experience, and times like this are going to happen again. And I think would be wise of us to try to figure out and capture as much as we can about how we move through it as lessons for the future. All right, those are my recommendations. You can take them or leave them. Those are Deborah's recommendations. Sometimes it helps though to say, hey, this, I don't know, Deborah from the University of Minnesota, she said these things. I don't know what you think of those. All right, so along with those recommendations are then this planning process that I've created for you. It's a 7-step process. I'm going to quickly run through the 7 steps. I'm not going to give you a real big sense of them, but just so you know sort of the logic to it. And then we're going to dip into step 5, which is that one that I've kind of highlighted. These, like everything else that I do, I don't give you the answers. I give you the way to have conversation about it and come to decision about it with lots of fodder for thinking, right? And exploring. The first step that I want you to consider taking is really to get ready to advocate for shifting what and how you measure. Okay. That's the first thing you need to do, is figure out what do we need to do if we want to shift something? How do we do that? How do we advocate for that? So step 1 is going to give you some ideas about some of the evidence that would support what you might want to do around shifting, some things to think about. It has you start to explore, do you know right now, are you clear? Has there been communication from your funders about what what they're thinking about is reasonable around measurement right now? All of those things. So that's step 1. step 2 is actually connecting with funders to explore, is it possible to shift? Okay. And so we have some real practical things, like we ask you to and help you go through an elevator pitch process, essentially, where you try to make your pitch for, here's why I think it makes sense to shift, and here's what I need, and here's what we'd see at the end of that. So funders can quickly kind of understand what you're asking for. So that's step 2. Step 3 is you got to create a working group here. There is going to be some work to be done to shift your evaluation. I don't think that's an all on deck situation. I think it's a small, tight group that can move pretty fast. We don't want this to be a 6-month process, honestly. It should be 1 to 2, right? So we want to get through it because it should be flexible enough that it can change because something's going to change. Step 4 is engage with staff and young people about what they see as the most important questions to answer. Just like we had that little mini conversation in your small groups, I, in this step, really encourage you to go directly to the source of those closest to the experience, which are your direct service youth workers and the young people themselves, and say, what do you think we should be paying attention to? What do you think we should know and understand? What do I want? What do you want to know and understand about our spaces in here? And I think those are the things that should help you filter, use that as a filter then for what you're going to end up measuring during your year. Step 5 is really beefy. It is the actual creation of the evaluation plan. And inside that is a whole host of possible things that you could measure, and tools and templates to your heart's content, probably. So there's all kinds of practical stuff in that step. Step 6 and 7 are the natural outcome. You get that plan, you collect your data, you analyze it, and we have 2 ways we were suggesting you use it. One is regularly for short opportunities for change and improvement, and then longer term, a report about all the different things you learned across the time period, okay, with all that short little sets of data. So that's what the planning process overview looks like. If you don't have questions, I'm going to jump in because we got about 13 minutes into step 5, so we can take a peek at the kind of stuff that's in there. Is there any questions on the chat I should be aware of? Rachel?
No questions as of now, but thanks, Lori, for advocating from a funder perspective on encouraging conversations with funders.
Yes. Yeah, there's actually in the council nonprofit, in the nonprofit community overall, and the philanthropy community, there has been I don't know what it's called. Lori, you'd remember, I don't remember that, but it's like an agreement or a charter or a something. There's a word for it that funders are encouraging each other to sign on, and one of the things inside that is to reconsider evaluation, right? And so this is happening in lots of places, this kind of conversation. And Lori and Rachel and others have been helpful in trying to figure out how United Way is involved in that conversation, trying to figure out how do we support also conversation in funding groups about what does that mean, right? Because that's a differently complex reality for funders as well as for our youth programs. All right, so for all of the steps, what you're going to get in the plan are a set of resources that go with them, and then a process to use to work through in a staff meeting or in a work group meeting that are pretty simple. The process in this step, there's actually 4 parts to it. So I'll run through those, and then we're going to just kind of take a look at some of the ways we're trying to explode, as I like to call it, the way you're thinking about how you could measure and what you could measure. The first step in the process is that we want you to compare and contrast the measures you had planned, right? So one of the things you do in an earlier step is you look at what are all the expectations that are out there that for your program to measure and be accountable to, right? In some kind of report. So first you got to just do I know what did I say we were going to measure, right? So let's get that on paper. So we want to compare that with when you have your conversations with staff and young people. What do they say it's really critical to understand right now? So it would not be surprising, for me at least, for staff and young people to both say, the things I'm really kind of concerned about is that, how is everyone doing, right? Our mental health and wellness. That would be a very common thing for people to shift measurement around in a time like this. And so, and that may or may not have been something you measured before. For most of it, probably wasn't, right? Unless we had a very specific focus and purpose inside our program, right? Not that we weren't concerned about it or maybe did some things, but it wasn't a major focus. So we're going to have you in this first step really compare those two sets of here's what we said we're going to measure, here's what we're now hearing might be useful to measure. Let's look and see how they match up or not. That's really what that first conversation is about. The next thing you're going to do is, given that, what measures might fit better with the needs that you have around evaluating right now. And that's where there is copious amounts. I've done some really careful curating of some good tools out there around needs assessment of both communities and young people. Mental health and wellness assessments. These are all free and accessible things that are actually pretty darn good, right? So I've done some vetting of them. So there's that. So you had to sort of then say, okay, given maybe these 3 or 4 things that we think are really critical things to pay attention to and measure around and do something with that data, then we want you to pick some measures that might get you some information that will help you. And then the third thing, so after you sort of pick the way you're going to measure or the what you're going to measure, then you're going to pick the way you're going to measure. When you got that, then there's a template, a really awesome, simple draft of an evaluation plan template that you're going to just fill out. So you're kind of clear on, oh, here's the things we're trying to understand, the mental health and wellness of young people being one of those things, perhaps. Here's what we're going to do to understand that. Here's how we're going to use it. Here's when we're going to use it. And then here's how we're going to analyze it, right? So inside that second step and third step, we're really trying to blow up the possibilities, pushing on that idea of less formal or informal measures as to what is considered data. So to me, there's very little in the world that wouldn't be considered data, right? But I think a lot of us have ideas about what is data based on our experiences, the way we're taught about who collects data, who's an evaluator, who's a researcher, what is data, all of that. To me, we're all researchers and evaluators every day if we think of it in certain ways, right? We all are making assessments based on what we see around us, what we hear, what we're experiencing, and do things with that information in ways that we see as helpful to ourselves or others. Okay, so to me, that's data. So I think we have to really, this year in particular, I would say always, because I think a broad range of data is always more interesting and more rich. But we for sure this year should think much farther beyond surveys, which may or may not be the most helpful data to us right now because people's experiences are heightened and different in a pandemic. So think about things like interviews. Think about things like visual representations. What I mean by that is I could imagine being in an online session with young people. And one of the things we ask them to do is go out on the web and find an image that represents how they're feeling today, and then have them get in a conversation and share why. You know, that is just like some way of representing something that around a question you're asking. Okay, that's data. Of course, questionnaires and surveys. We also could do observations. I think it'd be really interesting right now. In fact, I think I'm going to do a project with some undergrads this semester, where we're going to sit into some Zoom calls or some Google Hangouts in youth programs and just kind of observe, just take notes and observe whatever we can see and hear. So you could do observations. You could look at documents and records. You could look at, things like how are people constructing what they do in their online work? And you could just look at a bunch of them and see, what do I notice? You could hold some focus groups or some breakout rooms on your Zoom session. You could look at the kinds of activities you are tending to do with young people and what is that saying? What is it telling us? Time studies might be really interesting if you're trying to understand how staff, for example, are spending their time. For 1 week, have them track, like, how much time do they spend on what activities? If you've never done that in your work life, it is fascinating. I've had to do it twice in my life. For a supervisor. It was fascinating. I had no idea. Like we all probably underestimate and overestimate stuff. So that's kind of interesting. It'd be interesting for young people to do a time study. Take 2 days out of your week and track what you're doing for the majority of that day. Wouldn't that be interesting to know? I would love to know. I know a lot about what my daughter's doing because it's just the 2 of us in the house right now. So I could probably give you her time study, but I would find that very useful data to know about what's it like for the young people right now. Oral histories are another. So again, what I'm trying to say to you is that we've got to think much more broadly about what is considered data right now. And there's really rich opportunity to understand and know things differently if we gather a broader set of data that we collect. Questions about any of that? Those are methods of data collection. All right. So just to give you a peek at some of the potential of kind of going in this direction, I took this question of how we're supporting young people's mental health and wellness during COVID-19, and I thought about ways we could gather quantitative data and ways we could gather qualitative, just again to give us like more possibilities to imagine, besides, taking paper surveys or even online 30 question surveys. All right, so one thing we could do is something really simple and doesn't seem terrifically hard, is that we could count how many times staff provided information, did personal outreach, email, phone, or text, or provided a learning activity around the supporting mental health, right? Like just count, just simple counting. Right now, that would be really helpful to know how much of it are we doing? Because we're doing a lot more of it as our sense, but we don't know how much more are we doing? By actual counting. We could look at how we could count how much more support we're providing to basic needs. I think that is one of the stories that I've heard so far. We'll see how that continues, especially as we're hitting our second or third wave, depending on how you talk about with infection rates. I think that this is going to continue, right? So families are, still losing jobs inside families, still food insecurity, and how does that, just how much of that kind of work are we doing is important to note if you're seeing shifts in your program. You easily could hold at a staff session when you're online with your fellow colleagues. You could pull out some of the YPQA practices that I love, and I would pick the ones that most relate to mental health, like connection and belonging, for example, and see how you think you're doing as a mini reflection with each other. And depending on what you learn, even in your self-assessment of that, so what do we want to do about it, right? So do a little mini action assessment, reflection, and action planning process. You also could do something really simple. I have learned from undergraduate students the power of Instagram and research, which you had to drag me to that. No, I said, yeah, try it. I, of course, in my little, brain was like, it's not going to work. It worked awesome. They posted one question on Instagram, and they got the most interesting and varied responses. You could post a mental health and wellness question on Instagram every week and asking people to send your responses in, and you could have a conversation about that together. That'd be cool, right? They'll do that. I'm surprised at how much people said on Instagram. I'm like, okay, that's awesome. All right, so those are some things you could do. More qualitatively, create a collage or a drawing that describes something, using that same question again about young people's mental health. There's an activity in Jocelyn, do you guys have that in Sprockets? I know I have the Quality Matters Reflection Toolkit, but I feel like it's on a Weichert thing too. All the different techniques around reflection activities. But there's this one called Standing in the Shadows of Our Success, which I love this activity where you go to the place in the room where you feel like you felt most awesome and connected to whatever it was you're doing. You could do the same in a Zoom in some way. You just have to create the virtual space. But again, thinking creatively about that's data, right? If we're asking young people like, hey, what did we do today? Like, I'm going to put you in 4 breakout rooms or whatever, if we imagined there were 4 corners of the room, which corner would you put yourself in and why? You could do that easily, I think. You could capture the discussion and key points of discussion on paper and do an analysis of that once a month, just to see what you're learning about your own practices, again, to capture change. You could have staff interview young people to get their perspective individually as a part of maybe they're doing individual one-on-one check-ins right now. I know I am with a lot of my students. So So that's, again, just to have you think differently about the kinds of data and the formats of data. All right, so we're getting close to being done for the day. It looks like we're at 1:59. So so can you quick pull out your chat boxes, and if it might be that some of you are already doing some really interesting data collection that maybe you want to share with other folks and they can learn from your own brilliance. So if you can put that in the chat box, that would be great. And then Rachel's going to read me in a second. For those of you, while you're thinking, and I know you all can multitask, we've only gotten better on it when we've been in Zoom so much, right? Just note that I think today, right, Jocelyn, today the stuff is going out. So you'll get your planning guide today. There's going to be a link to a Google Drive. That's where all the documents and templates and everything sits in support with the planning guide. So that you should get that later today. That's, you know, I think that's when it's going out. And then just a reminder that there is critical media literacy is really an interesting thing. Everybody should know something about this. But there's a really great session that Sprocket's doing tomorrow from 10 to noon on teaching a critical lens through, well, you can see it on the screen. All right, so that's something coming up. All right, Rachel, anything interesting in the chat box that someone's doing around evaluation already?
We have one person who said they keep a program diary of meetings and sessions and activities done.
That's awesome.
So
that's
really
awesome.
cool.
Yeah, that's everybody could do that, right? Just grab a notebook and just say it's my diary or my journal or whatever you like. I am like a huge fan of, like, it makes it fancy if it's in a nice folder. Right? So yeah, you can just write down notes every day. If you stop and just read through those notes, you're going to learn something about what's going on for sure. That's a great idea. Okay. Any other ones?
Yeah, Haley talked about documenting support around basic needs and weekly activities around social emotional learning.
Awesome. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely connected to that question of mental health and wellness. Cool. Okay.
And we don't have any other ones, but I was just going to share some ones that because we did this session on Tuesday. So ideas that folks had on Tuesday where they created a hashtag on Instagram and Twitter where young people could share responses to the questions or share reflections. So you had mentioned that, Deborah, already. Using Google Forms, mind mapping, brainstorming sessions, doing individual check-ins with youth, either bi-weekly or monthly, and then doing some testimonials and still doing some kind of surveys for sure to ask some questions. So.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that I at least gave you a peek into the guide and some of what you can expect inside that, as well as maybe got you grounded in sort of the place I'm suggesting that you start to view evaluation in a new way. So hopefully that given you a little space to say it's okay to consider evaluation a little bit differently this year. All right, so before you go, I would, however, like you to answer this question because, again, this is data that we will bring back to funders and stakeholders. And in the chat box, if you would, before you leave, give us an answer, an idea about if funders and stakeholders could do one thing to support how you evaluate this year, what would it be? We'll take that data very seriously with you. I know an hour is still a long amount of time to stay focused on anything right now. So I appreciate you hung in there. As always, you are welcome to contact me directly. Email is always best. Someone will put my email. Jocelyn, usually you're the one with my email in the chat box because I'm on presenter view. So I have to get out. You're welcome to contact me if you have questions or need something else. I always say I'm a cheap date. I used to say if we can go have a cup of coffee, I'll spend an hour. That's fine. I'm happy to do that. Now, if we drink coffee on Zoom, that works too. So you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions about anything in the materials. I wish you all of the love and the support as you move through this. This has been work that has been important to me to make sure that the youth workers in my community are getting support that they need and deserve, because you are doing extremely important work with our young people right now. Never been more important than right now. So I thank you for that.